might imagine having 6 meetings with the client throughout the entire project, maybe 8. By the time this project was finished, we had had 28 meetings with the client, each meeting lasting about an hour. So we really, really earned our money. From their point of view, of course, they were all giving up their time for free, and they kind of expected the same from us. Now, of course, it may well be, if you're a member of that church, you want to give your time for nothing. As it was, we were simply appointed as architects. And so we tried to keep it on an even keel, and we tried to make sure that the money they were paying us was paying for the amount of service we were giving and paying for the staff we were employing. But it's a warning that you can easily get sucked in with a charity client because you think it's such a good cause, but at the end of the day, if you're running a business, you have to be really, really careful. And the last one, which we will come back to again and again, I'm afraid, is a contractor can sometimes be your client. Now, this is a bit of a puzzle to you as architects, I appreciate that, but by the end of our 12 lectures, you will be up to speed on all this, because trust me, this is the world we live in now. In this country, in the United Kingdom, over half the projects that are being constructed are contractor-led. That means that the architect is employed by the contractor. The architect is still doing design work, of course, still getting planning permission, still getting building regs, still making sure it's all safe for fire, specifying bricks, all the rest of it, but the truth is they are working for the contractor, and that means the contractor calls the shots. So if the contractor decides to change all the windows from aluminium to UPVC, or downspec the roof from natural Welsh slates to some Eternit copies, then the architect has to say yes. As long as you can get it through planning, you have to say yes. So now it's a completely different, everything's turned on its head. Now there's no reason why design build can't be used to deliver high quality projects. And there are examples in Liverpool of good quality projects. But the relationship and the way you're appointed suddenly changes. And all the things you've learnt change. So no longer are you the kingpin. No longer are you calling the shots. No longer are you the custodian of quality, crawling over the job and saying, that's not right. All of a sudden you're working for the contractor. Now, as you can imagine, contractors are really sharp clients, especially the larger contractors. They have a raft of documents which you're signed up against. You have a raft of key performance indicators. You have responsibility matrices. They have you stitched up like a kipper, so that this is a different world and a very precise world. And again, our relationship with the client is different. So, as I've said, on the library job I talked about in the very first lecture, we had a client representative who was the project manager from the estates department, and he was our main point of contact. With different jobs, there can be different representatives, and of course this is the thing. There's the person you're dealing with day to day, which you kind of imagine is the client, and then there's the person who's paying the bills, and you need to be able to think about them separately sometimes, because you need to keep both of them happy. So where we've got a one-off owner, occupier, domestic client, the representative is the owner, is the husband and wife team, whatever it is, dead straightforward. And that's why it can be difficult, because they care enormously about the project. With the larger organisations, you might have an estates manager. If you're dealing with Tesco or Travelodge, they have these professional project managers who are your client representative. They tend to be very, very experienced and very sharp, and they are the people with whom you interface. In the public sector, we have a whole department here at the University of Liverpool, the facilities department, and they have their own project managers. There's about a dozen There might be as many as a dozen project managers here at the university, and they will each be dealing with one of the many projects that are being built around the campus, and they will be the person who's the key contact for the architect. And if you want to go and speak to a professor of law, because you're doing a law department, you will always do it with the project manager in attendance to make sure the professor of law tells you the story that the estates department want you to tell. Sometimes the project manager can be a consultant. So this is like a different profession. And even with this university, sometimes they choose to employ a consultant who's actually working for an outside organisation. So being a project manager is a discipline in its own right. And the best of these guys are absolutely fantastic and add enormously to the project. So sometimes your client representative isn't even employed by the client directly. They are actually subcontracted in as a separate organisation. And lastly, with a design-build contractor, your client representative may be a thing called a design manager. So the good design-build contractors have someone who's called a design manager, and quite often this person is a qualified architect. They've just chosen to go and work for a contractor. And what they will do with you is they will basically, first of all, organise what I want by when. They will get the whole design team round a table, and they will get everybody talking to each other. They will explain the standards they want, and when it's design build, they will feed back what the supply chain wants to do. So here, with the Greenbank projects, the university have chosen to go with a concrete frame building for various reasons. There's lots of reasons behind that, to do with impact sound, to do with longevity, buildability, and having no downstand beams, and all sorts of other things. So when that architect is first involved in the first meetings, it may well be that around the design team table will come the contractor, the concrete contractor, and he is part of what's called the supply chain, and he will say, well, look, you know, the smallest we can have columns is this big, and by the way, slabs can either be this or this, and you'll need to put a screed on top of them or whatever it is. But they will provide input, and that's how it works when you're doing design build. So client representatives take many forms, and we do a lot of work for the fire service here in Liverpool. The client representative, with whom I form a really good relationship, they're a very decent outfit, and as it happens, our client representative is an ex-fire person who's retired, because you tend to retire from active service after 50. The fact that I can keep him super happy doesn't change the fact that our money is coming from a different place, from the fire service, paid for by the accounts department, with a procurement officer, etc., and that's a different relationship. Stakeholders. So what are they? And what forms do they take? So you will find in your very early in your careers, when you start working next year, that you have to interface with a number of people in order to get the information you need. And on some of the best studio projects that you do, your studio lead will involve real life people who may come in and talk about what they want. I mean, we did one with Alder Hey recently, where people from Alder Hey came and talked about their aspirations. I'm not sure if they didn't have one of the mums of a patient who came and talked. These are stakeholders. And so it is in real life. These people are absolutely crucial to find out what is going on. So the people you would need to consult, well, first of all, there's the clients. So that's all the people we've talked about on the previous slide who are really important to you. The funders. Now, if you are doing a project particularly for a commercial client, the way commercial projects work is, the guy who's initiated it, the guy who's appointed you, or lady, isn't necessarily the person with the money. What they sometimes do is, they say, I'm going to do this 12-storey block of flats in Liverpool. I'm going to get 24 flats out of it. It's going to cost around 6 million, and if you invest in it, I will give you 20% return over 3 years. Do you want to give me some money? 20% over 3 years isn't bad. There's a risk, but it's not bad at all. So a lot of people will wade in. Say, yep, I won't necessarily give you the full 6 million, but I'll give you 3, and somebody else will say, well, I'll give you 1. So you've got these funders. So now the developer is doing a project, not necessarily with his own money. Now, sometimes these funders are big organisations, pension funds, finance houses, all sorts of things. And supposing you're doing a £25 million job in London, and supposing one institution is bringing in most of that £25 million, well, guess what? They're really interested in how that project's going to be organised, whether it's hitting its targets, how tricky planning is going to be, what the risks are. The architect says he's going to make it totally out of timber, but the funder doesn't like that. So all of a sudden, the funders start having quite a big say in how the thing is being organised. And managing the funders can be a trick in itself. And I was reading a case study only a couple of months ago. An architect, this would be you in next year, he's working in an office, and he was really pleased with himself because he was going to do the first 20-storey CLT building in the country, cross-laminated timber. I'm sure you've all heard about that. And the office was really proud of themselves, blah, 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 blah. It got close to going onto site. The funders had cold feet. And the funders said, no, we're going to make it out of concrete. So they had to redraw all their drawings, and at the last minute they had to change all the construction drawings to concrete because the funders wouldn't go with CLT because they heard about Grenfell, and even though they'd had all these assurances, they didn't want the risk. So sometimes the funders can be an important stakeholder. The staff users of the building. So this is easy to discuss because we are having a new extension to our School of Architecture, and it's going to be revamped, and it's £18 million. And we have had an organisation called Fusion who've asked 1,000,001 questions of the staff. I think they may even met with representatives of the students. They've certainly met with some of my MArch students. And they ask you all 1,000,000 questions about how do you do this, and how are tutorials done, and what sort of workshop do you want, and how do you work in groups, and blah, 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 blah. So these are important stakeholders. You are an important stakeholder in the forthcoming extension to the School of Architecture. So now you've got other users of the buildings who are stakeholders. So a colleague of mine works for a big commercial practice up in Newcastle who do lots of shopping centres, etc., etc. The shoppers, their perception of the buildings and what they think of the last project they did are really important. So they may well interview the shoppers, they may get feedback, and they may modify their approach in the light of the feedback they had on the last project they have done. Expert advisors to the client. So other stakeholders, say in this university, might be when you're doing a complex job for the University of Liverpool, obviously how all the IT and the data is done is really important. They have certain specialists they like you to consult, and they make decisions about how the infrastructure works so that you can all get your Wi-Fi, or that Wi-Fi isn't suitable for security reasons and it's all got to be hardwired. And these guys are very, very specialised, and what actually happens is they tend to come in when a job is finished, so you need to understand how they're going to mess up the building, because you don't want all the ceilings ripped down after you finish, so you need them in at the right time. So these are further stakeholders. The local community, so we do lots of schools around Cheshire, and quite often those schools will have a community element in their project. So they might let out their hall for Zumba classes, or they may have, sketching sessions in the evenings for members of the community, or they might let their playing fields be used by the local football teams. So these people, the local community, can be a very important part of the stakeholder team in order to make sure that the designs you're producing are correct. And finally, the local authority. So at the same school I'm thinking about, which we've done recently, which is in Northwich in Cheshire, there were certain issues to do with how the building sat in its proximity to what is inevitably a residential area. We were doing certain things, we were building quite close to the boundary, we were messing around with car parking, and we needed the local authority on message. We needed them to agree that we could do all these things so that when we actually went for planning permission, they were in agreement. We needed to explain our aspirations, why we were doing certain things. We weren't just doing them for arbitrary reasons. They were all doing to benefit the community. So the local authority became an important stakeholder. So if you think about a school, which you're all familiar with schools, a list of stakeholders might go from the head teacher, who probably has engaged you, and probably authorises payments to you, the governors, who in fact sit above the head teacher, but make strategic decisions, and you would probably have to make presentations to the school governors on 1 or 2 occasions to make sure that they're totally in agreement with the scheme that you're doing. You've got the head of department, so the head of music, the head of languages, whoever it is that you're affecting, they're experts in their field, or maybe they're doing to do with workshops. They would be stakeholders. Other staff, so we've got admin people, we've got the people who run the canteen, they will be important stakeholders if you're messing around with those areas. And in fact, how the building is maintained is important, so there will almost certainly be a maintenance manager who you'll need to consult, because he'll need to agree that the sort of windows you're specifying, which have got these sorts of openers and have to be cleaned in this way, they're okay with him, because you don't want to hand over a building that is difficult to maintain. The children, the students of the school, are a stakeholder, and we have on occasions had to make presentations to what they call the school council, so there might be a group of 12 school children there, and we explain what we're doing. Now you can imagine when we're interfacing with them, the head teacher is very nervy that we only tell them enough, we don't tell them too much, and the feedback they give us, that they want a swimming pool and a sauna, is taken with a pinch of salt. They can only have what funding will allow. Parents, very important stakeholders. They may well be providing some funding. They might be helping with some of the fundraising, or they may just be to do with the way they interface with the kids and how they are received if they're coming in to talk about a problem that their pupil has, and you need to make sure that that reception area is sensitively designed. And the last one is the wider community, which I've already touched upon. So you can see that raft of stakeholders, just for a simple £500,000 school extension, we need to make sure all of those people are consulted, but they're consulted in the proper way. The stakeholders on the LRC that I talked about in the very first lecture, well, the client, the VC, definitely took an interest. We've got the estates people, we've got the head of learning resources or librarian, but we dealt with a lot. We dealt with the head of IT. We really did deal with the maintenance manager to make sure he was happy not only with the way in which the windows open, but also the specification for roofing that we were going to use, to make sure he basically bought into a flat roof that could be dealt with in this way, and I can sweep the leaves off that way to stop the valley, the gutters blocking would be okay. And the grounds manager, as it happened, because the building you saw in the first lecture had extensive landscaping. And so we needed to make sure that the way we did that was in agreement with the way the grounds people work. Just out of interest, we also had problems with funders. Not problems, but there was £2 million tied into that library. And in order to get that money from the government, we had to have certain key performance indicators. So they were a stakeholder, and if we didn't make sure it did this, 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 and this, the university wouldn't get their money. And one of those key performance indicators was BREEAM Excellent. And if we hadn't delivered BREEAM Excellent, the university wouldn't have got their money. And of course the students. We really did chat to the students about what they wanted to make sure that this learning cafe met with their aspirations. So that takes us through clients and stakeholders and the world that we have to inhabit when we're doing real projects, because we need to make sure all of these people are on message and none of them are unhappy at the end of the day. Or if they are unhappy, that you can pull out a bit of paper and say, whoa, just a minute now. When we discussed the workshop, you told me if we have this, this, and this, and a store this big, it would be okay. That's what I've given you. So don't come moaning to me now the store isn't big enough, because I did consult you at the right time, and I've done what you asked me to do. Okay, so we're now in the business of professional agreements. And I want you to try and lodge that little diagram in your minds, because it crops up 2 or 3 times in these lectures. And if your mind goes blank in the exam, in the multiple choice exam, which I'm sure is very easy to do, time, costs, and quality. It's a sort of magic eternal triangle which affects all sorts of things, including project management. In this particular case, it's affecting our professional engagement. So now, imagine your auntie has asked you to do an extension to the back of her house, and she's going to pay you. So now you need to strike a deal. You need to have a little, even if it's a handwritten note, that says, "Dear auntie, I'll do your extension, I'll get your planning and building regs, and I want £1,000, please, and I want to be paid at the end when I've done everything." Okay. So, time, you might say to your auntie, "By the way, it's going to take me 2 months to do all this, then it'll take you another month to get tenders, then it'll take another 12 weeks to build it, so that's like 6 months of time." So she's not misunderstanding. And cost, your auntie might be interested in how much it's going to cost. You say, "Well, you know, just rule of thumb, say £1,500 a square metre, we're looking at about 20 grand. Have you got 20 grand? Great, fine, off." And then quality. Does she want something really, really basic, or does she want some really snazzy glass, frameless glazed, conservatory, blah, blah, blah? You need a little chat. So you also need to know, what does she want you to do in terms of the quality of your service? So all she wants you to do is to get planning and building regs, and just hand her the stuff and she'll sort out the builders. That's great. That's the quality of service you're going to do. So it's both the quality of the project and the quality of the service. Okay, so 4 things. What is the project? You know, and what standards are required? Is it a gallery in Mayfair? Or is it a shed for a guy who makes widgets? What is required? And you would almost certainly put in your little letter, you want me to make a shed, so to design a shed that you can continue to make your widgets in. What professional service is required? And we'll come on to this in future lectures, but in an ideal world, for your auntie, you're going to hold her hand and help her all the way from initial concept design, right through doing the scheme design, through doing all the technical drawings, and then getting her tenders, and then keeping an eye on the builder, and then saying at the end, "He's built it just like you wanted it. It's fine, you can pay him." That's called a full service, okay? So that is one level of professional service. The absolute minimum that your auntie could ask you to do is get planning permission. So you get permission from the local authority that it's okay to put an extension on the back of my house that's this big by this big by this high. And that's the sort of minimum service that you might do. And obviously this makes a big difference to your fee. What's the budget? Well, it's obvious, I've talked about that. But again, there could be misunderstandings about that. And what's the time scale, to give an idea of what is reasonable. And often clients have very unrealistic expectations of what to expect. When I gave this lecture, not this lecture, but the one next, in this very room last year, one of my colleagues from ABW Architects sat there and was meant to be telling you what it's like to be an architect. And he announced that he had just been given a job to put a new library on a job on a campus of one of the colleges north of Liverpool, and that had to be open by September. So if you think about that, that's just sort of about 8 months to design it, get planning permission, get it out to tender, get a contractor going, get it constructed. I would say that's almost impossible. Now, Simon said to the client that their firm could deliver it. I'm not sure I would have done, and I never actually asked him whether they did deliver it or whether it all went by the by. I don't know. But obviously sometimes clients can have unrealistic expectations on budget, on time, and you're the person who needs to tell them what's realistic and what's not realistic, or else you're putting your head in a noose. Before I just do this one, referring back to that very first lecture with the library, I told you that the client, when they appointed us, had a vision of this learning cafe, that it was a non-institutional library. They definitely had a fixed budget. They had this amount of money and not a penny more, because that's all they had got from the government and they couldn't add any more money. So although they weren't sure what they wanted, they certainly had a fixed idea on budget, and they had a broad idea on programme, but that wasn't too critical. Okay, so a professional engagement is the sort of document that you have, be it a letter, be it an email, or be it a big long document, and it sets out the terms and conditions between you and the client. And you'll know from your dreaded phones that whenever somebody updates something or you decide to do something, you get those things where you have to go blah, 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 agree. And you know, it's about 30 pages long, and do you read that stuff? But unless you click agree, you can't have the update of the operating system or whatever it is. So at worst, it's like that. At best, it's a simple letter which just sets out the key terms. So what are the key clauses that might be included in a professional engagement? Now, unfortunately for you, we are in exam territory here. But don't worry, because I put revision notes at the end of this thing. So just try and, today, just try and embrace the spirit of it. Don't be, desperately trying to make notes. I try and give you really good revision notes, because basically, the way I see these lectures is I hope I can take you from somewhere where you know pretty much nothing about what it's like to work in an office and try and make a living as an architect, to somewhere where next September or next June you can get a job in an office and feel a little bit confident that you're not going to make a fool of yourself, that you understand the terms people are talking about, and you do understand that actually architecture, running a business, running a practice is a business, and you don't come across too naive. That's my goal over these 12 lectures. Sadly, the university insists on examining you. It's a very, very tough subject. So what I try and do is I try and condense it into some key principles, and I try and help you with the revision notes. But of course, those revision notes will only mean something to you if you come along to the lectures. And I very much appreciate a good turnout today on a really shitty day, and when half of you are wherever you are. So carrying on. Key clauses. Identify the parties in the agreement. So normally, it's DGC, my practice, are going to form a contract with University of Liverpool, the client. Allocate and define limitations of responsibility. So this is where you will say, we are definitely going to be responsible for designing this, 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 and this. But, for instance, we're not doing the IT infrastructure. Or, do you know what? We don't know how to design the acoustic separation between two lecture rooms. We'll need an expert to do that. So you might put in the clause, we're going to design the general layout of the 4 lecture theatres, but we will require an acoustics consultant to design the gap between the two, because that's highly technical. So you might set out what you are not doing. You're going to define the scope. So even in the simplest letter to your auntie, you're going to say, we're doing an extension at the back of your house for your kitchen, full stop. And that means that when your auntie decides also what she wants is a utility room and a study, well then, 6 months later, 3 months later, you can say, auntie, when I said I'd do it all for 500 quid, that was when it was just a kitchen. You've now added a study and a utility room. It's a bit harder for me, and so I want some extra money. So you're going to set out the scope. And you can imagine on a complex job, say working for this university, you will set out the scope really carefully, because it's important, because everything tends to creep. Projects tend to get bigger. This is just a detail that you'll confirm the law. Now, okay, this is actually of interest to some of our XJTLU students. If you're working in Scotland, the law is different from in England. If you're working in China, it's absolutely completely different from in the UK. So much so that UK practices can't work in China. They have to have a local design institute, and the laws are completely different there. So, you would set out the framework within which you're working. You're going to confirm the fee. That's to say, we'll do it for 500 quid, or we're going to do it for 5% of the construction cost. and you're going to confirm the method of calculation. So you might say, because you don't know what on earth you want, and because this we're at a very early stage, what I'm going to do is I'm going to charge you £60 an hour, and you're going to pay me for every hour I work on the job. Now, my hunch is that we're going to need about 4,000 quid to look at it sensibly for you. But I'm not guaranteeing it's only 4,000 quid. I'm just giving you an idea there. You will pay me for what I do. So you're going to set out the fee and the method of calculation. You would have to set out the dispute resolution. So you know when you buy something and there's all this nonsense about your statutory rights aren't affected, blah, 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 blah. Well, it's the same when you're selling architectural services. You have to set out, if you all fall out, how you're going to resolve your dispute. And strangely, you have to set that out at the outset, which seems a bit odd really, because you haven't fallen out yet. But you have to set out, if we all fall out, this is how it's going to be resolved. And finally, you're going to put provisions for termination. So this is another legal thing, really. But you know, if you're working for a large organisation and it's £1 million worth of fees, and you all fall out halfway through, well, we need to understand on what basis you can terminate the contract, because you don't really want to continue to work for a client that you're very unhappy about, or you think is unprofessional, or isn't being fair. You want to have a system for termination, and that would be set out in the agreement. That's a bit of a technical one, but the main things are to do with who are contracting, what are you doing, what's the scope, and what's the fee. So it's that three things: time, cost, and quality. Okay, so I haven't got these on my thing. What does that say? Yeah. The point about this is that in an ideal world, you get appointed direct by the client. So the architect has one of these agreements with the client saying, I'll do this and that for 500 quid. The cost consultant gets an agreement with the client. The structural engineer gets an agreement with the client, and so it goes on. Now, what some clients try and do is they try and make the architect appoint everybody else. Now, that might be the next slide. No. Yeah. So what they sometimes try and do, we do a lot of work for the diocese, the Church of England. They have schools and things. And when you work for the diocese, they appoint us, and then they say, and you've got to appoint anybody you need to do the job. So if it's a complicated job, well, first of all, you might want a cost consultant to make sure the thing stays on message. If you're doing all sorts of tricksy foundations or you're knocking something down, you would want a structural engineer. And if it's anything at all sophisticated with radiators or ventilation systems or whatever, you'll most certainly need a services engineer. But what they insist is, we'll appoint you, you appoint those guys. So what do you think the disadvantage of that is? Well, of course, you're taking tons more responsibility. If the thing starts developing cracks after a year of being built, the client is going to come talking to you. You, in turn, have to go and talk to the cost consultant, and to the structural engineer, and any claims, any legal action will almost certainly go via you. So in taking these sub-consultants on, which is what they're called, sub-consultants, you are inevitably taking on more responsibility than you would be doing if you did that one. Because, oh God, what am I doing here? Sorry, guys. I'm completely lost. And back. Yeah. Sorry about that. Anyway, anybody who was falling asleep, maybe who's woken up now. You were very good at not falling asleep. When I've always done lectures for the RIBA to Part 3 students, and you know, I've been doing it for probably 20 years. So I was basically an architect, and then, you know, once a year I'd be dragged in to talk to Part 3 students about fees and project management. And it used to really spook me if somebody fell asleep I just wasn't, oh my God, of course your eye kept drawn to this person who's falling asleep. But of course, once you're a university lecturer, it's like people only come to lectures to have a little snooze, I think, sometimes. But anyway, carrying on. So that arrangement, you can see, you are responsible only for the thing you are doing, and everybody else is responsible for their bit. And when you have sub-consultants, then it's more complicated. The good news is that there is a thing that the RIBA produced, which is a standard agreement. And in terms of your exams, that's the answer you need to give. It's default. Just use the standard RIBA agreement. It covers all bases. And why is that? Well, it avoids misunderstandings and disputes. It defines the fees and the payment stages in a sort of standard way, so there's like a standard formula for how you do it. It refers to copyright. So we'll come on to this in a future lecture, but the thing is, very often, with commercial clients, you can be very successful in getting planning permission for a big job by using your skill, and then the client can get rid of you. Now you've just increased the value of the land he bought from, 3 million to 6 million, and he's just pushed you out of the way. Now, the reason it's gone up in value is because of the skill and care you had in terms of your design. And that is all covered by copyright. But only if you refer to it, and the standard RIBA appointment document refers to copyright. If you're writing your own one, you need to remember, and just out of interest, the law in mainland China is very different in terms of copyright. They have a very different view on copyright, so things change there too. In the standard agreement, it'll have a fair allocation of risk between the client and the architect, so it sort of sets out fairly. The architect is going to do this, 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 and this. The client is going to pay them regularly and do this and give a brief and all the rest of it, so it sets all of that out. And so therefore, you would argue to your client, it provides clarity and comfort to both parties. So when the client says, oh God, I don't like the look of this eight-page document, you say, well, actually, it's there very much for your protection as much as for mine. It's been set out in a fair way. It's going to incorporate standard industry practices. So I did mention that we do a lot of work for the fire service in Liverpool. The fire service have their own bespoke agreements drawn up by some hotshot London lawyers, which actually bias it very much towards the client, so that they make us more responsible for things, much more onerous than is the case with the RIBA agreement. So you have to watch out when you come across bespoke agreements. And finally, in the RIBA agreement, it refers to complying with the ARB and the ARB, the RIBA and the ARB codes, which of course require you to have professional insurance, etc. So on the LRC that I talked about in the first lecture, we did indeed use the standard RIBA documents. And although people might tell you it's a bit burdensome, I've used it many times, and if I sit across the table with a head teacher filling in an agreement, it would normally take me probably a couple of hours. And of course, in filling it in, it means that you've covered the important things. Because it's got lots of headings, you're discussing things about when you want to be paid and how quickly you want to be paid and what you've been doing, who you're to liaise with. So it's actually quite a useful process. This is really just for your information, that there are a number of different standard agreements that are available off the shelf from the RIBA. There's the standard one. There's a domestic one, which is really what you'd use if it's like a one-off small client. The sub-consultant agreement. So this would be where you have employed the structural engineer. So if the client's employing you, and you're employing the structural engineer, then you need a sub-consultant agreement because you want to tie up your deal between you and a structural engineer. You can have contracted design services, so this is where you're working in a D&B capacity. Multidisciplinary services is that appointment that I've got. I remember I told you we're working for the diocese, and then I've got all these people working underneath me. Now I might want a multidisciplinary appointment between me and the client, because I'm offering a number of services, not just architecture. I'm offering architecture and structural engineering and services engineering and maybe landscaping, so I want a multidisciplinary agreement. There's a special agreement for interior design services, and then there's a funny little role that you can do which is called client advisor. So quite often on large projects, in addition to the client employing you as the architect, the client might employ another expert, tame architect to kind of whisper in their ear and help them maneuver through the process, and that person is a client advisor, a slightly unusual and specialized service. Yeah, so that is slightly out of order, isn't it? But what I'm trying to say there is these are sub-consultants. When you have to employ all the specialists yourself as the architect, they're called sub-consultants. And the agreement that you would have with them is called a sub-consultant agreement, and the agreement you might then have with the client is called a multidisciplinary agreement, because you're providing all these different services. And then, do you remember I mentioned that many projects in this country are design-build? So in design-build, those are the contractual relationships. The client employs the contractor. A very simple link. The contractor then employs the architect. They might have their own QS. They will almost certainly have a structural engineer. Will almost certainly have a services engineer. But they are all employed by the contractor. So it's a different setup. Is that clear? This is important. Is that clear? Yeah? Okay. Because it's a mystery to some Part 3 students at interview. And they've been working on a design-build job for the last year. So these principles are really, really important, because they change everything. You can see that that poor little architect down there, what power has she got to affect things? If the contractor's going to use some really dodgy bricks that were never in the original agreement, they can't whisper to the client. They can't go behind the scenes and whisper to the client. They just have to sit there. I mean, they could send a memo to the contractor saying, "I've noticed you're using the wrong bricks." But if the contractor says, "Well, keep your nose out of it, nothing to do with you, we're saving a few bob," the contractor has to sit, the architect has to sit on her hands. So this is a tricky area. Okay, so that's all the different links. We're now going to talk about communications in abstract. This is something which even Part 3 students, so you guys 4 years on, find difficult. Because you are all used to the old, texting, whatever. You get very, very quick, but very sloppy in the way you communicate. Because that's just normal. That's considered normal between friends. That's the way you do things. All sorts of abbreviations, dashes, God knows what else. Now the thing is that still it is the case in the world of work, a much higher standard is required. Now it may be, if I'm still around and giving this lecture in 10 years' time, it'll be a different story. And the sort of colloquial way in which we all communicate with each other on phones, or sometimes in emails, or WhatsApp, or whatever it is, that feeds up to the world of the professions, and people in the professions become less sort of precious about the way they communicate. That is not the case now. The situation now is any email you send out is very carefully constructed, is very clear, is put very professionally, is pretty diplomatic, So if you have a criticism, you put it very carefully. You don't just slag somebody off. And there's a whole raft of ways in which we communicate, which you will battle with in your early years, I'm afraid, and I certainly still battle with. If I've got a difficult letter going out of the office to complain to a client that they haven't paid us, or to have a go at a contractor because they're miles behind program, I would almost certainly draft it. I would hand it to my business partner. He'd fiddle with it. He'd ping it back to me. I'd change it, and eventually it might go out a day later. So even in the real world, and even with experienced people like me, letter writing and communicating and writing emails is difficult. And all I'm trying to do today is give you an awareness of these different layers of ways of communicating. There's no test on this. There's not a question in the exam about how would you phrase something, so don't worry about it. I'm only warning you that this is difficult. Very rarely people have natural skills in this area, but the majority find this really difficult.